Love Child and Forever's relationship is complex, grounded in a mix of loyalty, power dynamics, and ambition that keep them deeply entangled, yet constantly at odds. Love Child, though young, is street smart and ambitious, and he's made a name for himself by carving out a niche in the South, bringing in girls from big cities where the stakes and competition are high. He learned much of the game through trial and error, and though he's a smooth talker, he relies on his trusted bottom woman for insights that only experience can bring. Forever is that anchor, possessing a maturity and knowledge that Love Child values, if not outright depends on. As his bottom, she is both a confidant and a mentor, but unlike other women who might be content in this role, Forever has aspirations of her own. She dreams of independence, of being a madam in her own right, running her own girls, and perhaps even surpassing Love Child's operation. This ambition isn't lost on him. He knows her too well to ignore her desire for control, which creates a tension between them. Forever, despite her aspirations, genuinely loves Love Child, seeing in him a mix of potential and vulnerability she's grown protective of. She understands the world they operate in better than he does in some ways, and part of her longs to see him rise. But there's a part of her that wants to test her own limits, to see if she can survive, even thrive, outside his shadow. When Forever decides to take her team to Myrtle Beach for the Black Bike Fest, it's her first real taste of autonomy. She wants to prove that she doesn't need Love Child's permission or protection, that she's capable of handling herself and her girls. But when her plans go south, when her team is robbed and she's left exposed and vulnerable, she finds herself in an unexpected position, calling for Love Child's help. The call is loaded with unspoken emotions. For Love Child, it's a validation of his role as her protector, but it also stirs a mix of anger and pride. For Forever, it's a humbling moment, a reminder that independence in their world isn't as straightforward as she hoped. Their bond is deeply rooted, built on shared struggles and a complicated loyalty that transcends traditional roles. Despite her rebellious streak, Forever knows that Love Child will come for her, and for him, it's not just about business, it's about her. In this crisis, they are reminded of the messy, intertwined nature of their relationship, an allegiance tested by ambition and love, but ultimately bound by a loyalty they can't easily shake. The weekend at the beach was anything but a vacation. Love Child's arrival, flanked by Big Cap, transformed Forever plan for independence into a tense standoff, where the stakes were as high as her ambitions had been. Forever knew she'd crossed a line, taking her girls down without Love Child's knowledge or permission. And as she watched the price of his protection triple, she felt the bitter sting of both pride and consequence. His sudden authority over her girls, demanding pimp arrest and total control, reminded her that her rebellion was a temporary illusion in his world. Once the girls were hustled into the black SUV, they could feel the air thick with unspoken tension. The drive to the oceanfront beach house was silent, punctuated only by the low hum of the car's engine and the occasional quiet exchange between Love Child and Big Cap. Forever girls, a mix of fresh-faced and street-smart, exchanged worried glances, sensing the reality of the situation they'd found themselves in. Forever held her composure, knowing that, for better or worse, Love Child would keep them safe. But she also knew they'd pay for this weekend with more than just cash. At the beach house, a sprawling yet secluded rental with views of the Atlantic, Love Child wasted no time. The windows faced the ocean, but the girls barely noticed the luxury of their surroundings. Love Child instructed each of them to strip, not in an act of humiliation, but as part of a calculated move to establish dominance and remind them all who held power. With Big Cap standing guard, Love Child went through each girl's belongings, confiscating cash, jewelry, and any other valuables they might have hidden. This was his way of reasserting control, making it clear that their renegade excursion had no place in his world. For Forever, the weekend felt like a twisted reunion, a painful reminder of both her bond with Love Child and the price of her defiance. She had wanted freedom, but she knew she was now more deeply entwined in his web. Every time she looked at him, there was an unspoken war of emotions: anger, longing, respect, and frustration. She had tried to escape his grip, but there was something magnetic about his pull that kept her bound. The weekend was strict and business-oriented. Lovechild made it clear that this wasn't about pleasure, and the girls quickly fell in line. He set out their schedules, organized who would work where, and even handed out new rules and expectations. At night, they could hear the distant sounds of motorcycles and music from the Black Bike Fest. But Lovechild kept them on a tight leash, working his network and arranging clients. This wasn't the easygoing escapade Forever had planned, but a grueling, nonstop weekend that reinforced Lovechild's authority. On the final day, as the weekend drew to a close, Lovechild called Forever aside. She braced herself, expecting a lecture or punishment, but he was calm. He acknowledged her ambition and even hinted that he respected her desire to operate independently, yet reminded her that in this world, loyalty and trust weren't negotiable. It was a rare, candid moment between them, tinged with both understanding and the unbreakable boundaries he'd set. As they loaded up to leave Myrtle Beach, Forever was left with a hard-earned lesson. Independence would always come at a cost, and loyalty to Lovechild was as much a survival tactic as it was a bond she couldn't deny. This weekend had tested her limits, but it had also redefined the boundaries of their relationship, setting the stage for a future filled with both promise and tension. With the tension of the initial confrontation finally softened, the beach house took on a different energy. Lovechild leaned back, a glass in hand, finally relaxing for the first time since he'd arrived. Forever had come to him humbled, apologizing for her risky stunt and assuring him that she was, once again, firmly in his corner. She knew she'd tested his patience, but now she was determined to prove that, despite her ambitions, her loyalty lay with him. Her apology was more than words. She was begging for the chance to redeem herself and to show him she could bring in more than ever before, even at Myrtle Beach. After a moment of consideration, Lovechild finally gave her a nod, signaling that he'd allow her the chance to prove her loyalty anew. He knew Forever was ambitious and rebellious, but he also knew she was resourceful, capable, and driven, a combination that, if channeled correctly, was profitable. Forever felt a mix of relief and resolve. She had his blessing, and she wasn't going to waste it. She promised Lovechild that she would bring him a king's ransom, a bounty worthy of his time and trust. With her girls alongside her and Big Cap keeping an eye from a distance, Forever hit the Myrtle Beach Strip. The boardwalk was bustling, filled with tourists, bikers, and partygoers out for the Black Bike Fest. It was the perfect setting for her to work her magic. She knew how to catch eyes and make connections, and her girls followed suit, mingling confidently in the crowd and sizing up potential clients. She directed her girls with the precision and efficiency that came from years in the game, working the crowd and bringing in cash with the fervor she knew Lovechild expected. The night wore on, with Forever and her team working non-stop, their efforts yielding stacks of cash, more than enough to keep their promise to Lovechild. Forever felt a sense of pride mixed with relief. She had set out to prove herself, and this time, she wasn't holding anything back. When she returned to the beach house with her girls, her hands filled with the night's earnings, she felt the tension lift. She'd kept her word and showed Lovechild that her loyalty was real, her ambition now fueled by a deeper sense of commitment to him. As she presented him with the night's earnings, Lovechild looked at her with something between approval and acknowledgement. She'd come through for him, and in doing so she'd shown him not only her loyalty, but her worth. This experience had reset the terms of their relationship. Forever had earned back his trust, but she'd also earned a new level of respect. The weekend had transformed from a tense confrontation into a defining moment for both of them, a testament to their bond, built on a balance of loyalty, ambition, and a fierce need for survival. Forever had gambled and paid the price, but in the end, she'd proven her loyalty and cemented her place beside him, the two of them bound by a partnership forged in risk and reward. Love child game was tight. After all, he did anything and everything to keep Fariva under his control. He sat back and took a long pull from his cigar and thought back when she almost died. The information she knew on him and his operation would have went up in smoke. Love Child's heart raced as he entered Jacobi Hospital, the sterile scent and echoing hallways making him feel out of place, stripped of the power he wielded in the streets. Forever had nearly died, a fact he hadn't fully processed until he was faced with the beeping machines and muffled cries from the other rooms on her floor. Hearing the news of her fall had shaken him in a way he hadn't expected. He wasn't one to admit vulnerability, but this wasn't just anyone, this was Fariva. She'd held him down through his rise, and he'd been forced to reckon with what her absence would mean to him. Now, he just wanted to see her, to make sure she was really still here. But on the way up, he encountered an unexpected obstacle. Forever Mother. She stepped into the elevator with him, arms crossed, her face set in a hardened stare. He could tell she recognized him immediately. Her eyes narrowed, filled with a protective fury that made her words even sharper. "No, not today. I don't want you to see my daughter," she said firmly, barely able to contain her anger. "What do you want with her, anyway? Isn't she broken enough?" Love Child didn't respond. His instinct was to say something sharp in return, but he held his tongue, realizing that she didn't know what he felt for Fariva or the bond they shared. But his silence seemed to fuel her frustration even more. She watched him as the elevator doors opened, muttering something under her breath before hurrying down the hall ahead of him. By the time he reached the nurse's station, her mother had spoken to security, and they blocked his path. The commotion must have reached Forever, who was lying in her hospital bed, surrounded by bandages with her right leg suspended, each breath a struggle. She heard the familiar deep tones of his voice beyond the door, a sound that grounded her even now. With all the strength she could muster, she screamed, "Let him in!" Her voice pierced the quiet of the ward, filled with pain but also determination. She fought against her mother's grasp and the nurse's hands as they tried to keep her calm. Love Child's chest tightened as he heard her calling for him. Security finally relented, and he pushed through the door, striding over to her bedside. For a moment, he just looked at her, the sight of her broken body shaking something loose inside him. Gone was her usual confidence, the spark he knew so well dulled by her injuries, but her spirit was unmistakably intact. Her eyes softened when she saw him, a hint of relief blending with the exhaustion on her face. "Why'd you come all this way?" she whispered, voice cracking. He leaned in closer, his voice low. "You think I wouldn't?" he replied, a rare warmth in his tone. "I had to see you for myself. Make sure you're still here. Don't you ever scare me like this again." Fareva managed a small, pained smile, her hand reaching out to touch his. It was a small gesture, but it was all she could manage. Her mother, standing in the doorway, looked on with disapproval, but she couldn't deny the bond they shared, a connection that neither time nor distance could break. This wasn't the life she wanted for her daughter, but even she had to admit that Love Child cared for Forever in a way that was complicated but undeniable. Over the next few hours, Love Child stayed by Forever's side, listening to her recount what had happened, his anger simmering at the thought of those who had hurt her. He didn't leave until he was certain she was stable, his presence as much a promise as it was a show of support. This incident only strengthened their bond, sealing it with a renewed commitment to protect each other, even if it meant navigating the treacherous landscape of the life they'd chosen. Love Child had made up his mind, Forever wasn't just any girl. She was his girl, his bottom, the one he could rely on through the highs and lows of their rough world. After all they'd been through, he was determined to take her home, away from the danger and the weight of the city that had nearly broken her. He knew this was a risky move, but he had Big Cap by his side, ready to handle whatever came their way. They'd planned every detail of the escape from the hospital, knowing it wouldn't be long before word got out. Late in the night, Love Child and Big Cap slipped into the hospital, both silent and steady. Big Cap knew the back exits and the right turns, the quiet hallways and unmanned stairwells, They found Forever, still hooked up to machines, her face marked by the pain she'd endured, but softened now by the heavy medication that dulled her senses. Lovechild leaned close, whispering gently in her ear. "I'm bringing you home to the South, baby." She managed a weak smile, her fingers curling around his hand as he gently lifted her and carried her down the hall. In the back of the SUV, they laid her down carefully, her body wrapped in a warm blanket. The meds kept her slipping in and out of consciousness, her breath slow, as if she were drifting in a dream. Lovechild leaned over her, stroking her hair, his face softened with a rare tenderness. This was his way of protecting her, of showing her she'd never have to go through this alone again. As they began to drive off, Lovechild spotted flashing lights in the rearview mirror. The unmistakable sirens cut through the quiet, a signal that they'd been found out. He tensed, eyes meeting Big Cap's in the mirror. They knew what this meant. Someone had tipped off the authorities, and they were closing in fast. Big Cap didn't hesitate. "Take her and get out of here," he said, his voice steady and determined. "They're after the truck, not you. I'll hold 'em off." Lovechild's jaw tightened, the weight of the situation sinking in. He knew the risk Big Cap was taking, but he also knew he had no choice. Lovechild pressed a kiss to Forever's forehead, a promise that he'd see her safely through this, then slipped out of the SUV and into his sleek, black Mercedes S63 AMG coupe parked just around the corner. The engine roared to life as he sped off. Forever lying half-conscious in the back seat, her head resting on the leather, unaware of the tense escape that was unfolding around her. Behind him, Big Cap stayed in the SUV, calmly waiting as the police cars pulled up, surrounding him. He knew the story he'd tell, knew he'd be ready to take the fall if it meant giving Lovechild and Forever a clean break. Big Cap's loyalty to Lovechild ran deep, and he'd proven more than once that he'd do whatever it took to protect him and those close to him. As Lovechild drove through the dimly lit streets, his focus was singular, getting Forever to safety, putting as much distance between them and the city that had nearly cost her life. He stole a glance back at her, feeling a mixture of relief and determination. The South was calling, a place where he felt in control, where he could ensure her safety and rebuild what they had nearly lost. In her dazed state, Forever murmured his name, her voice soft and distant. Lovechild reached back, gently squeezing her hand. "We're almost there, baby," he whispered, pressing the gas and speeding off into the night, leaving behind the flashing lights and the chaos in Big Cap's capable hands. The promise of a new beginning lay ahead, and Lovechild knew that, with Forever by his side, they could take on anything together. Big Cap sat in the driver's seat of the SUV, every muscle tensed as the officers approached. His calm exterior masked the intensity of the situation, but he had two fully automatic pistols with switches ready, hidden just out of sight. He wasn't one to make threats lightly, and though he knew he'd do whatever it took to protect Lovechild and Forever, he kept his expression neutral, even relaxed, as the officers requested his license and registration. The police, on edge due to the tip they'd received, eyed him carefully as he handed over the documents. They asked if he'd seen anyone fitting Forever's description, or if he knew anything about the reported kidnapping, but Big Cap gave nothing away. His calm, unassuming demeanor didn't match the suspect's description, and after a moment of silent scrutiny, the officers backed off, apologizing for the trouble. Big Cap didn't let his guard down until they were out of sight, his grip on the pistols finally easing. His instincts had been right to stay in the car, prepared for anything, but tonight he was fortunate. Their mission hadn't required a more intense response. He took a deep breath, waiting a few minutes just to be sure, before calling Lovechild to let him know the coast was clear. "We're good." They backed off, he said, keeping his tone steady. Lovechild, who had been driving Forever further away from the city lights, listened with relief. Big Cap was his most trusted ally, someone who could handle situations even as tense as this without so much as breaking a sweat. "Good work, man," Lovechild replied, glancing back at Forever in the back seat. "I'll see you at the spot in an hour. This plane isn't waiting." Big Cap drove off, weaving through the city streets and making his way upstate toward the private airstrip. Love Child, meanwhile, kept to quiet roads, his mind focused on reaching the takeoff location without attracting further attention. Forever lay in the back seat, still fading in and out from the painkillers, her whispered words occasionally breaking the silence. He kept his voice calm as he reassured her, his touch gentle, determined to get her out of the tri-state and far from the reach of anyone who would dare try to harm her. When they finally reached the airstrip, the sleek jet sat ready, engines humming softly in the moonlit night. Big Cap was already there, waiting near the runway, his posture relaxed but eyes sharp as always. He walked over to the car as Love Child carefully lifted Forever from the back seat, carrying her toward the jet with a careful urgency. Big Cap followed closely, keeping watch as they boarded. Inside the jet, Love Child settled Forever onto a plush seat, her head resting against his shoulder as the engines revved. Big Cap took his place nearby, the three of them finally exhaling as the plane took off, lifting them away from the city that had nearly consumed them. As the tri-state disappeared beneath the clouds, Love Child held Forever close, feeling the relief of knowing she was safe, of knowing that he had her by his side. This escape was more than a way out. It was a clean slate, a fresh start down south where he could rebuild, where the loyalty between them could grow even stronger. With Big Cap at his side and Forever finally out of harm's reach, Love Child felt a new surge of purpose. They'd survived the city's grip, and as they sped through the night sky toward a new future, he knew that together they were unstoppable. To be continued.